Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
My brother laughed, actually laughed, right in my face and said, "No offense, but you'd ruin the vibe." That was his official reason for not inviting me to his 30th birthday party, which he was throwing at some trendy rooftop bar downtown that required reservations 3 weeks in advance, a social media following, and probably a blood oath to a DJ from Brooklyn. He said it in front of everyone, his girlfriend Bree, our parents, two of his friends, and that one guy who always pretends like he's in finance but has never had a job anyone can verify. It wasn't just the words that got to me, though. It was the laughter. Bree snorted into her mimosa and muttered something about me killing the aesthetic. And our mom did this thing she always does, where she doesn't laugh out loud, but smiles nervously and looks down, like maybe if she doesn't make eye contact, she won't have to pick a side. I should have been used to it by now. My brother Zach has always been the loud, camera-ready one, the kind of person who can lie straight to someone's face with confidence and still get them to like and follow him. He grew up golden. I mean that literally. He was blonde until he was about 15, and he rode that California golden boy energy all through high school, college, and into his lifestyle influencer career. I've spent my life walking behind him quietly cleaning up his messes. I don't mean that in a metaphorical older sister way. I mean, I have physically written his cover letters, talked him out of 2 lawsuits, and designed the website he now uses to promote his completely fabricated line of motivational seminars. But back to the brunch table. When Zach dropped the ruin the vibe comment, I didn't say anything. I didn't flinch. I didn't try to laugh it off or ask what he meant. I just looked at him, blinked once, and said, "Got it," before pushing my chair back and excusing myself. I left my untouched pancakes and took my coffee to go, even though it was lukewarm. I could feel everyone watching me as I walked out, probably expecting me to call back something bitter or dramatic. But I've learned the most effective thing you can do in moments like that is absolutely nothing. Let the silence haunt them. What Zach and the rest of his Vibe crew didn't know was that I had already received a call 2 days earlier that was about to shift my entire week, and possibly my entire future. A former client of mine, someone I'd helped through a pretty brutal PR scandal 5 years ago, had passed my name along to a senior producer at one of the major networks. They were planning a new feature series about the hidden forces behind modern media, the quiet professionals who shape public perception without ever stepping in front of the camera. They wanted to fly me out for a guest segment, originally scheduled for later in the month, but when the producer called again to finalize, she casually asked if I'd be open to filling in this coming weekend. One of their booked guests had dropped out. I was hesitant. I don't love the spotlight. I build brands, I spin stories, I manage chaos. I don't like becoming the story, but I told her I'd think about it. Then Zach told me I'd ruin the vibe. That night, I sent the producer a text. "Let's do it, full segment, I'm all in." She replied in under 2 minutes with flight details. I didn't even pack much, just one navy dress, low heels, and a folder of notes that I'd been adding to quietly for the past 5 years. See, while Zach was out there building his illusion of a career, I was documenting everything. Not for revenge, at least not at first, but because when you live in the shadow of someone who manipulates truth for a living, it becomes second nature to keep records. I wasn't planning on using any of it on air, but I knew I needed to be ready, just in case. 2 days later, while Zach was posting gym selfies and videos of Bree accidentally catching him dancing shirtless in the kitchen, I was sitting in a black SUV on the way to the studio, sipping water and watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I wasn't nervous. I was steady, focused. The producer told me I'd be going live during the last segment of the show, right after a panel on corporate accountability and celebrity culture. The timing was perfect. The nation was already in the mood to hear about how fame was manufactured, how certain influencers were just smoke and mirrors held together by algorithms and fake engagement. I walked onto the set 10 minutes before we went live. The host, a polished woman named Renee, who had this calm, lethal energy I instantly admired, shook my hand and said, "Glad you're here. Don't hold back." That was it. No fluff, no you'll do great. Just an invitation to be honest. I liked her instantly. We went live at 8:47. I could see the red light blink above the camera, and I took a deep breath. I wasn't there to take anyone down. But I also wasn't going to protect the people who never once protected me. I spoke about the architecture of public personas, the people who ghostwrite tweets, curate Instagram captions, time posts for maximum impact. I explained how some personal brands are backed by entire shadow teams who ensure that even their so-called vulnerabilities are perfectly timed and profitable. And when Renee asked if I had ever worked with someone like that personally, I didn't name Zach. I just said, more than once. Some of them are people you'd never expect. They look polished on the outside, but if you scratch the surface, you'd find manipulation, unethical sponsorships, even psychological abuse used to keep people close. These aren't brands, they're houses of cards. It wasn't a hit piece, but it didn't need to be. The internet connected the dots faster than I ever could. Zach's followers, many of whom were already skeptical of his rapid rise, began pulling receipts. Someone remembered a now-deleted tweet. Another dug up a podcast clip. Screenshots resurfaced. Threads exploded. By the time I got back to my hotel room that night, Zach's name was trending, and not for any reason he'd want. I lay in bed, phone buzzing every few seconds, and just stared at the ceiling. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty either. I felt clean, like something had been washed off me. Years of being dismissed, diminished, and shoved into the background just lifted. And the best part? I hadn't even started yet. If there's one thing I've learned from a decade of working behind the scenes in media and branding, it's that perception is currency, more valuable, in fact, than money, integrity, or even talent. Because in the world my brother lives in, the appearance of success is treated as a substitute for the real thing. And those who can manipulate a crowd into believing they're important are often elevated above the ones actually doing the work. That morning, while Zach was getting his hair cut by a guy who charges $300 for content-friendly fades and planning his dramatic rooftop entrance with Brie, I was sitting in a makeup chair under bright studio lights, answering last-minute questions from a production assistant who kept glancing at me with the kind of cautious curiosity usually reserved for celebrities in disguise. I wasn't nervous. I've never been particularly affected by spotlights or attention, maybe because I've spent most of my professional life preparing other people to step into them. But there was a peculiar calm running through me that morning. A kind of focused stillness, like my body had finally registered that I wasn't reacting anymore, that I wasn't trying to fit in or smooth things over or apologize for being inconvenient. I was stepping into something deliberately, on my own terms, and while the timing had been serendipitous, the momentum was entirely mine. The studio was larger than I expected, sleek and modern with black floors and icy blue lights that gave everything a slightly surreal glow, as if I were stepping into a different layer of reality, one where people like me weren't pushed aside because we didn't match the curated vibe of some trendy clique. The producers were polite but efficient, the crew moved like clockwork, and Renee, the host, gave me a quick nod before stepping into her own pre-show rhythm. She didn't try to butter me up with compliments or fake intimacy, which I appreciated, because I knew exactly how exhausting it was to maintain that kind of facade and how quickly it crumbles under real pressure. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, Zach was standing on a faux grass-covered rooftop with a champagne flute in one hand and a phone in the other, posting story after story of his carefully planned celebration. The party had a theme, of course it did. Something vague and pretentious like golden hour vibes, which really just meant everyone had to wear pastels and pretend to look candid, while a hired drone operator flew overhead to capture what Zach would later claim were organic moments. Brie, in her predictable peach slip dress, was orchestrating the whole thing like a stage director pretending to be spontaneous, making sure the lighting was just right and that the influencer wall they'd commissioned was properly framed in every shot. Back in the studio, my segment was scheduled as the closer, the final interview of the show, which meant I'd be the last voice the audience heard before the credits rolled. And in our world, that's prime real estate. The interview itself had been framed around the concept of invisible architects, the people behind the screen who build the stories, brands, and public personas we consume every day without knowing who crafted them. The producers had seen my client list, carefully anonymized, of course, but recognizable enough to pique their interest, and they wanted to give the audience a peek behind the curtain. I spoke clearly, methodically, avoiding anything that sounded bitter or personal. Because the goal wasn't to vent, it was to expose, to illuminate, to shift the narrative just enough that people started asking questions they hadn't considered before. I explained how influencers borrow credibility, how they manufacture relatability by fabricating struggle, how entire online identities are managed like ad campaigns, with scheduled vulnerability and monetized transparency. I talked about ghostwriters for apology videos, PR teams that coach facial expressions for apology tours, and the symbiotic relationship between crisis and clout. And then Renee asked the question I knew was coming, the one the producers had hinted at but never confirmed. Have you ever worked with someone currently in the spotlight, someone the public wouldn't suspect is being managed behind the scenes? There was a pause, a long, delicious moment of silence where the air seemed to thicken, and I knew beyond a doubt that the next words I spoke were going to land like a thunderclap. I didn't say Zach's name. I didn't have to. All I said was, there's a certain tier of influencer who thinks branding is a natural talent when really it's a series of carefully learned tricks. The most successful ones aren't authentic, they're obedient. They follow strategy like scripture. And sometimes, when they forget who built their foundation, it crumbles. The camera cut to Renee, who raised an eyebrow and smiled in a way that said she understood the game and respected my play. The segment ended there, but the real show was just beginning. Because while the live broadcast only reached a few million viewers in the moment, the clip went viral within hours. Someone posted a side-by-side montage, Zach dancing shirtless with motivational captions, and then my calm, measured takedown of manufactured image. And it hit the Explore page like a match tossed onto dry grass. Comment sections exploded. People started asking questions. Who was she talking about? Is this about Zach? Someone found an old interview where Zach slipped up and mentioned hiring a ghost consultant. Someone else dug up screenshots from a Reddit thread claiming Zach stole content ideas from smaller creators. It didn't take long before people weren't just suspicious. They were furious. At the same time, Zach was still posting selfies, oblivious to the shifting tide. He didn't notice the drop in engagement right away, or the way comments turned more hostile, more sarcastic. But Bree noticed. She always notices. Her tone shifted halfway through the party, her smile tighter, her poses more frantic, as if trying to counteract something she couldn't quite name yet. Back at the hotel, I turned off my phone for the night. I didn't need to watch it unfold in real time. I'd already seen this kind of unraveling before. Slow at first, then sudden, like a thread pulled from a sweater until it collapses in your hands. I poured myself a glass of water, took off the heels I never liked wearing, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know how Zach would react, or whether my parents would call, or if the story would grow bigger than either of us could manage. But I did know one thing for sure. I hadn't said his name, hadn't called him out, hadn't declared war. All I did was speak, and the truth did the rest. By the time the sun had started its lazy descent behind the skyline, painting the windows of my hotel suite in that overly romanticized gold people seem to think symbolizes hope or redemption, I already knew something had shifted. Not in a subtle, almost mystic kind of way, but in a real, measurable, unmistakable sense that told me the balance had tilted, and there was no going back to how things had been. Not for me, and certainly not for Zach. While I stirred honey into my tea with the kind of calm that usually comes after a storm, not before it, my phone, silenced and face down on the nightstand, buzzed against the wood in relentless intervals, like a dying insect refusing to accept its fate, desperate to get one last bite in before the lights went out. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The machine had already started, and machines, once in motion, rarely stop for something as quaint as courtesy. Elsewhere, specifically at the downtown hotel, Zach had moved the after-party to. Because the rooftop bar had a strict 2-hour rental window and his carefully selected crowd wasn't ready to stop performing their curated spontaneity, things were beginning to unravel slowly at first, like a shoelace tugged at too hard, then quickly, disastrously, in a way that can only be described as karmic choreography. He was in the middle of a toast, standing on a velvet couch that someone's assistant had probably begged the staff not to stain, lifting a half-drunk glass of rosé above his head, surrounded by ring lights and people pretending to listen while checking their follower counts. Bree, of course, stood beside him, her arm looped through his like she was posing for a fragrance ad. And everything was on brand, down to the ironic playlist humming in the background and the strategically placed branded beverage coolers that no one touched unless they were recording. That's when one of Zach's old friends, I say friend, in the loosest, most algorithmic sense, walked up, phone in hand, face slightly too amused to be mistaken for anything other than trouble, and asked, with the subtlety of a wrecking ball, "Hey man, did you see that video going around? The one with your sister on live TV?" The words alone were enough to freeze Zach mid-toast, his smile faltering for just a second, his hand lowering like a puppet whose strings had been clipped. And that moment, brief, barely noticeable to anyone outside the echo chamber of his curated bubble, was the beginning of the end. Because no one at that party cared about me, not really. To them, I was a vague character in Zach's origin story, the older sister who had probably once been cool, but now, presumably, spent her weekends reading self-help books and posting inspirational quotes on Facebook for an audience of 3. But now I wasn't just some off-screen sibling. I was trending. I had been seen. More importantly, I had been heard, and not in the way women are often heard when they're angry or hurt or pleading for fairness, but in the way someone is heard when they sit down calmly, look straight into the camera, and tell the truth so plainly that no one can pretend it's fiction. And in the world my brother had built, a world where perception was everything, my truth was poison. The video clip, which was now being referred to as the takedown without names, had been reposted by 3 major media accounts, dissected by 2 YouTubers with millions of followers, and remixed into a TikTok duet that had already gone viral by the time Zach finally pulled out his phone and watched it with a sinking expression that, according to someone in the room, made even Bree stop smiling for the first time all night. There was no screaming, no smashing of phones or dramatic declarations, just a slow collapse of whatever fiction they'd been selling for the last 3 years. Because when the internet gets a whiff of hypocrisy, it doesn't just investigate, it devours. The hashtag started simple. Invisible. Architects. #authenticity matters. #PR unmasked. But then came the one that stuck. Zachgate, which began as a joke but quickly evolved into a full-blown digital referendum on Zach's entire existence. People started compiling timelines, digging up old collaborations, sponsorships, and life coaching seminars he had charged outrageous fees for without delivering any measurable value. One clip surfaced of him mocking mental health advice while simultaneously selling a mindfulness workbook he didn't write. Another thread revealed fake testimonials on his website, allegedly written by former clients who didn't exist. It was no longer just about a party. It was about the empire he'd built on curated vulnerability and stolen trust. At first, Zach didn't understand what was happening. He thought he could spin it, deflect it, ride it out like every minor controversy before. But this time, there wasn't an apology video he could post with sad music and filtered tears that would make it go away. The internet didn't want redemption, it wanted accountability. And worse, for him, it wanted answers. Back in my hotel room, I finally turned my phone over and skimmed the notifications. There were dozens of messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some supportive, others passive-aggressive, all flavored with that strange blend of curiosity and self-preservation that always bubbles up when someone suddenly becomes relevant again. A few were from Zach's friends, cautiously reaching out as if I held the keys to some secret they didn't yet understand, asking questions like, "Did you mean for it to come across like that? And do you think Zach's going to be okay?" I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I walked to the window, opened it slightly, and let the city noise drift in. A chorus of horns, distant shouting, the hum of movement. And for the first time in a very long while, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to feel the weight of something I couldn't yet name, and to understand that what I had set in motion wasn't just retribution, it was revelation. And I had no intention of stopping. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. Not a polite, hesitant knock, the kind you hear from someone with respect or remorse in their hands, but a hurried, agitated, almost desperate kind of knock that tells you the person on the other side isn't asking for entrance so much as demanding it. Not with authority, but with the brittle panic of someone who no longer feels in control of the story they thought they authored. I didn't look through the peephole because I already knew who it was. There was only one person left in this mess who would be shameless or shaken, enough to show up at my hotel room unannounced in the dead of night, reeking of anxiety and pride all tangled together like fishing line in a storm. I took my time opening the door, not to make a statement, but because I wanted a moment to inhale the stillness before letting chaos pour back in. Zach stood in the hallway, a shadow of his usual self, shoulders hunched slightly as though the weight of everything he'd built had finally started pressing down with more force than he could posture against. His phone clutched in one hand like it might suddenly redeem him if he just tapped hard enough. His usually crisp hair was unstyled. The curated stubble looked more accidental than intentional, and his expression wasn't angry, not yet, but hollow, like he'd stepped off a stage and realized there was no audience left clapping. He didn't ask to come in. He just brushed past me, mumbling something about needing to talk, and walked straight into the sitting area like this was still the world where he called the shots. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I watched him pace the short length of the room, glance out the window, then turn back toward me, with the kind of imploring confusion that makes you wonder whether the person you're looking at has any idea how responsible they are for the mess in their lap. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to apologize or even ask for an explanation. No, Zach, being Zach, came in swinging the only weapon he knew, accusation. "You knew this would happen," he said, voice low but sharp, like he was trying to hold on to his performative calm. "You didn't name me, but you knew people would figure it out. You wanted this. You wanted me to go down." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so classically him to frame this as if I had orchestrated some elaborate hit job, as if I were some Bond villain hiding behind a clean haircut and sensible heels, pulling strings to destroy the empire he barely knew how to maintain. I sat down on the armrest of the hotel chair, crossed one leg over the other, and looked him dead in the eye with the kind of clarity that only comes when you've stopped being afraid of what someone might think of you. "No, Zach," I said, voice steady, not because I was holding back emotion, but because I had already run through all of it and emerged on the other side. "I didn't want this. I didn't plan this. But you're damn right I knew it would happen eventually. And the only reason it didn't happen sooner is because I kept putting out your fires while you smiled for the camera and pretended you lit the torch yourself." He flinched at that, just a small, involuntary flicker of recognition in the eyes. But he recovered quickly, turning defensive, accusatory, angry in that self-righteous way he always reverted to when things stopped going his way. He launched into a ramble about betrayal, about family, about how I should have warned him, how I owe him some loyalty because we grew up in the same house. And all I could think while he spiraled was how many years I spent silently cleaning up behind him, smoothing over his mistakes with brands, clients, and even friends, all while he walked through life with the arrogance of someone who believed apologies were for the weak and consequences were for other people. I let him rant for a full 5 minutes. I let him spill every last drop of the delusion he'd been sipping for years. And then, when his breath started to hitch, and his arguments began looping in on themselves, I stood up, walked over to the desk, picked up a file folder I had quietly packed that morning, and handed it to him without a word. Inside was every contract I'd ghost negotiated on his behalf, every revision I'd made to his laughable business proposals, and every crisis I had handled while he posted thirst traps and motivational quotes on Instagram. There were timelines, emails, notes, evidence of a woman working behind the curtain while her brother took center stage and built a brand on her silence. He didn't open it, he just held it like it might burn him. And when he looked back at me, the anger was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous to his ego: realization. He whispered, more to himself than to me, "You were the reason any of it worked at all." I didn't nod. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked to the window, looked out at the glittering city, and said, "I never said anything because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd grow into the man everyone thinks you are. But you didn't. And when you laughed in my face and said I'd ruin your vibe, you gave me the permission I didn't know I needed to stop protecting you." He sat down heavily on the couch, phone buzzing again in his hand. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, that the device he worshipped, the portal through which he constructed his kingdom, was now delivering the very backlash he thought he'd be immune to. After a long pause, he finally asked, "So what now? Are you going to keep going?" I turned around slowly, arms folded, and said, "No, Zach, I'm not going to keep going, but other people will. I didn't tell them what to find. I just stopped hiding it for you, and they're a lot more motivated than I ever was." He didn't say anything after that, just sat there, defeated, overwhelmed, like a man who realized too late that the structure he built was made of matchsticks, and I'd merely stopped shielding it from the wind. A few minutes later, he stood up, mumbled something that might have been sorry, but wasn't nearly loud or direct enough to count, and left the room, leaving the file folder on the table, unopened, its contents waiting like a final exam he was too afraid to take. When the door closed behind him, I didn't cry, didn't sigh, didn't collapse into some dramatic catharsis. I just poured another cup of tea, walked over to the bed, and opened my laptop. There were already 3 interview requests in my inbox, 2 panel offers, and 1 curious email from a very large agency asking if I'd consider consulting on a rebrand they were preparing for one of their problematic clients. I replied to none of them, not yet, because I had a feeling this storm wasn't over, and I'd spent far too long cleaning up after one man's mess to jump headfirst into another. Let them come to me. Let them wait. The thing no one tells you about vindication is that it doesn't arrive with a parade. It doesn't walk through the door wearing a crown or offer you a toast, while the people who dismissed you drop to their knees in theatrical regret. No, what vindication does is quieter, more insidious, and far more satisfying. It shows up as an email at 4 a.m. from someone who once laughed in your face, and suddenly that same person is stumbling over themselves to rewrite the past into something that doesn't make them look so cowardly. In the days that followed Zach's visit to my hotel room, I watched, almost clinically, as the apologies began trickling in. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, like someone trying to rebuild a house that had long since burned down, starting with splinters and ashes, and hoping I wouldn't notice how late they were to the effort. It began with a message from Bree, of all people, who managed to pack 500 words into a single paragraph without saying anything meaningful, an impressive skill she likely honed while captioning photos of herself holding iced matcha in designer sweats, claiming she'd never felt more authentic. She wrote about vibes and misunderstandings, and how she never meant to exclude me, while conveniently failing to mention that she had personally removed my name from the original guest list. Something I knew because one of the catering coordinators, a former client of mine from an unrelated project, had forwarded me the unedited spreadsheet. She ended her message with a vague invitation to chat sometime soon if you're open to it, and attached a photo of us from a Christmas 4 years ago, cropped in such a way that she remained front and center, while I was blurry in the background, holding a wine glass and mid-blink. I didn't respond. Next came one from my mother, carefully composed in that anxious tone she adopted whenever she feared she'd backed the wrong child in a public family split. She said things like, "I just want to understand, and we never meant to take sides," which was ironic considering how many times I'd sat through dinners where she nervously laughed along with Zach's jokes at my expense, or told me I was just being too sensitive when I expressed frustration at being left out. She told me she and Dad had watched the interview and that it had really opened their eyes. And then she pivoted into a sentimental tangent about how proud my father had been when I got my first job in PR, as if resurrecting ancient support might cancel out decades of silence. She ended with, "We'd love to have you over for dinner sometime this week." And for the first time in my adult life, I genuinely wasn't sure whether I'd ever take them up on it. But the messages that surprised me the most were from Zach's friends, the same people who had clapped along to his toast at the rooftop party, the ones who never looked me in the eye at family gatherings, the ones who cheered when I walked away from that brunch table like I was some stubborn old relic refusing to evolve with the times. Now they were suddenly big fans of the interview, suddenly had no idea how much you were doing behind the scenes, suddenly full of admiration for the way I carried myself and kept things classy. One of them even asked if I'd be willing to help him with his own personal brand pivot, now that he was thinking of moving into public speaking, as if years of neglect and condescension could be brushed aside with a new LinkedIn header and a 3-slide pitch deck. I didn't delete the messages. I read every single one, not because I needed their words, but because I wanted to remember what it looked like when a house of cards collapsed in slow motion. I wanted to watch the rewrites of history they scrambled to craft, the desperate edits they applied to the memory of who I had been in their eyes. It was human, I suppose, this instinct to shift blame onto foggy recollections and false impressions. But it was also insulting in its own way, because it proved that the world Zach built hadn't been unique. It had just been one particularly obnoxious branch of a larger tree, one that drooped under the weight of self-delusion and glossy lies. Ironically, while my inbox was flooded with personal apologies, my professional email began filling with offers, slowly at first, then more steadily, until I had a queue of requests to speak on panels, contribute to books, consult for media companies that wanted to recenter truth in storytelling, and even a proposal to teach a workshop at a private retreat in Napa Valley, hosted by one of Zach's now former sponsors. I didn't respond to any of those either, at least not immediately, not because I didn't want the work, but because I needed to sit with the moment. After years of being behind the scenes, being overlooked, being referred to as Zach's sister, as though that were some sort of defining limitation, I was now something entirely different, someone people were finally beginning to see as her own force, her own architect of presence, unbothered by the noise and free from the obligation to explain herself. I spent the next few days in a quiet rhythm, long walks, long thoughts, slow mornings with real coffee, not the over-filtered oat milk performed kind you drink because someone told you it photographs well. I didn't speak much. I didn't answer calls. I simply allowed myself the stillness I'd never claimed when I was too busy propping up someone else's spotlight. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, somewhere between brewing tea and watching headlines shift from scandal to reckoning, I opened one final message. Not from Zach, not from Bree, not from anyone scrambling to rewrite the past, but from a woman I hadn't spoken to since high school, someone whose name I barely remembered, but whose words I will likely never forget. She wrote, "I saw your interview. I remember you from Mrs. Eaton's class. You always had the answers, but you never raised your hand. I don't know why I thought of that now, but I just wanted to say, I saw you, thank you." And that somehow struck deeper than all the apologies and flattery combined. Because in one line, she reminded me of something I hadn't fully realized until that moment. That sometimes you don't need to be loud or viral or glorified to change the shape of things. Sometimes it's enough to speak once, clearly with your whole self, and let the echo do what it was always meant to do. So when I finally did respond to one email, just one, carefully chosen from the pile, It was the one from the Napa Valley retreat. I told them I'd consider it, under the condition that I get to choose the topic, the format, and the people in the room. I wasn't interested in performing wisdom for an audience that just wanted to cleanse their image. I wanted real change, or I wanted nothing at all. And as I hit send, a quiet satisfaction curled in my chest. Not joy, not triumph, but something cleaner, sharper, more useful, clarity. No offense, Zach, but maybe, just maybe, you were never the vibe. I was. You just never noticed.